Good evening and welcome. Why have I written about Saudi Arabia? Because it is both the economic and spiritual center of the Middle East and a crucial ally of the West. It has a quarter of the world's oil. The US has just 2.5%. Saudi Arabia is also the cradle of Islam, the faith of almost a quarter of the world's people. Am I reverberating? Can you hear me fine? Okay. There are 25% more Muslims than Catholics, 3 times as many Muslims as Protestants, and more than 80 Muslims for every Jew. Today, 3 Muslim families control more than 40% of the Earth's oil reserves. The Al Saud of Saudi Arabia, the Al Sabah of Kuwait, and the Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. We're lucky that all 3 of these families are longtime American allies. By far, the most powerful of these 3 families is the Al Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, the world's only country named after a family. Their kingdom is almost as big as the US east of the Mississippi River. I'm hearing an echo of myself, so I want to ask again if you can all hear me fine. Okay, good. Saudi Arabia is easy to criticize. Women cannot drive or work with men or travel without a man's permission. And the religious police, although much tamer today, still harass women if they see hair or arm or ankle. Worse, until 9/11, the Saudi people carelessly sent millions of dollars abroad to schools that taught Muslim extremism and to charities that turned out to be fronts for Al-Qaeda. Since 2001, it has been open season on Saudi Arabia, and people who have never been to the country have written books with titles such as Hatred's Kingdom, Princes of Darkness, and The 2 Faces of Islam, The House of Saud, From Tradition to Terror. In one of the worst examples of this one-sidedness, Parade magazine, in an issue last year, had an article on the world's 10 worst dictators and ranked King Abdullah number 4, ahead of Robert Mugabe, the tyrant in Zimbabwe who has robbed his nation of a generation of economic progress. In fact, Abdullah is not a dictator at all because a Saudi king does an endless amount of consulting, and he's been a wise ruler. Saudi Arabia has been an ally of the West since 1915, first of Britain and then of the United States. Even during the Arab oil embargo of 1973 and 1974, when US-Saudi relations were at their worst, Saudi Arabia was still supplying plenty of oil to US troops fighting in Vietnam. It is true that after 9/11, there was a year of denial in Saudi Arabia. Most Saudis could not believe that a bunch of mountain boys, 11 of them from the same hilly region, could have pulled off something so well coordinated and deadly as 9/11. And I should tell you at this point that I have had a preview of Osama bin Laden in the afterworld. And George Washington goes up to him and punches him in the nose and says, "That's for killing 3,000 of my countrymen." And Patrick Henry slaps him back and forth across the face and says, "That's for trying to take away our liberty." And Thomas Jefferson kicks him in the groin. James Madison gives him a karate chop that makes him fall to the floor. And James Monroe takes a running jump and stomps on bin Laden. And bin Laden is really in agony now, and an angel appears. And bin Laden says to the angel, "This is not what you promised me." And the angel says, "Yes, it is. I promised you an eternity with 72 Virginians." Now, since 2002, after the initial year of denial, the Saudi government has killed over 150 homegrown terrorists and captured 1,000 more, largely from tips that the police have received from disgusted neighbors. The Saudis have also shared information with the FBI and CIA, stopped all Saudi charities from sending money abroad, fired or retired more than 1,300 militant clerics and forbidden them to preach at their mosques, and replaced millions of textbooks that had contained hostile references to Christians and Jews. One reason why Saudi culture is so different from our own is that the 800-mile-wide Arabian Peninsula was completely isolated from the rest of the world. Compared to the almost lifeless Arabian desert, the American Southwest is a garden. There is a resort city called Taif that looks like the interior of California, but to the Saudis it really is a garden. Most of Saudi Arabia looks more like Mars than the Mojave, so it is not surprising that until the 20th century, fewer than a dozen people had ever been to Riyadh. Saudi Arabia did not even have a high school until 1926, nor a girls' school until 1956. But today, almost 60% of the students in Saudi colleges and universities are women. Tuition is free, and there are more than 1,000 women studying abroad on government scholarships, and tens of thousands of Saudi men. In many Saudi families, although the grandmothers and the great-grandparents are illiterate, and the grandfather has just a high school education, and the parents have just, the grandfather has just an elementary school education, and the parents have just a high school education, many Saudi young people are in college now, and many of them are doing postgraduate work. So it's easy for an American to look at Saudi Arabia and say, oh, they're backward. But the Saudis themselves feel as if they are rocketing into the future. Most Saudi women do not like the word liberation. Instead, many like to quote an Egyptian writer who says that the goal of Muslim women is not to free themselves from men, but with men. One Saudi woman, Hanadi Hindi, is a jet pilot. She was trained in Jordan, and she flies the private jet of Saudi Prince Al-Walid. Yet she cannot drive a car. Last spring, however, Saudi Arabia's unelected parliament, its members are appointed by the king, passed a recommendation that women over 35 be allowed to drive from 7 in the morning until 8 at night. The Saudis do not want young women driving, and they don't want women driving at night, because they're terrified of the prospect of young people parking. King Abdullah has followed almost all of its parliament's recommendations, so we may see this half step toward women driving soon. It is also widely hoped that women will be voting in the municipal elections later this year. Once women drive, either male traffic policemen will be allowed to ask Saudi women to remove their facial veils, which would be rather like having an American policeman asking a woman here to remove her brassiere. Or much more likely, there will be female traffic policemen for the first time. So you bring in one change, it brings more. Because of gender segregation, it is difficult for young Saudis to meet people of the opposite sex. So 55% of Saudis end up marrying a first or second cousin. There are some genetic deformities, but many fewer than you might imagine. One woman I met she married a cousin and divorced him after he became abusive. But another woman I know received 4 proposals from cousins on her 18th birthday, married her favorite, and has lived happily ever after. Contrary to popular belief, Muhammad was a reformer who genuinely enjoyed the company of women. He outlawed female infanticide, encouraged women to learn to read, gave them a say in who they would marry, and let them inherit a half share of property, which sounds sexist now, but that was a revolutionary idea anywhere in the world until the 19th century. Another ancient Muslim I greatly admire is Ibn al-Haytham, the greatest authority on optics until the time of Isaac Newton. Around the year 1030, he observed that the twilight ends and darkness begins when the sun is 19 degrees below the horizon. And from this, he deduced that the air peters out 59 miles upward. Today, scientists say that the atmosphere ends and space begins. It's gradual, but the general dividing line they use is 100 kilometers, which is 62 miles. But I have a very close friend who works for NASA and is an expert on the upper atmosphere. And he says that the air actually peters out after 95 kilometers, which is, guess what, 59 miles. Ibn al-Haytham nailed it in the 1030s.